I'm going to start this pre-review with a quote from Walt Disney. Quote, "I do not like to repeat successes. I like to go on to other things." Unquote. It was that doctrine that made Walt Disney's creations groundbreaking. His passion for innovation and inspiration gave rise to the first cartoon with sound, Steamboat Willie, in 1928, the first cartoon utilizing the three-strip Technicolor process, Flowers and Trees, in 1932, and the first full-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937. Even with the theme parks, he always wanted them to be inventive and exciting, never tired. Sadly, Walt is no longer with us, and the company's business philosophies have shifted. Walt was not a proponent of sequels to his films, yet in 1994, we saw the beginning of a much maligned era in Disney history, direct-to-video sequels. The return of Jafar was at the helm of that ship, and led no less than 50 direct-to-video animated prequels, sequels, or side stories into people's homes during what has been named Disney's second Dark Age. The movies varied in quality, with most teetering on fair to poor. In 2007, Chief Creative Officer John Lasseter announced the end of the direct-to-video titles after the 2008 Tinkerbell would hit shelves. Contrary to his statement, we saw 6 more Tinkerbell flicks. While the sequel cash grabs had seemingly met their ends, another trend was developing within the Mouse House, a trend we're currently witnessing and will continue to see as long as Disney has classic films to its name. Live-action remakes. Actually, we have to go back a bit for the first remake. Nah, further back than that. Technically, the first Disney live-action remake of a previously animated movie was The Jungle Book, released on Christmas Day, 1994. The subsequent reboot, 101 Dalmatians, showed 2 years later, followed by its 2000 sequel. For the next 10 years, no sign of a live-action remake bearing the Disney name reared its head. That all changed on March 5th, 2010, with Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. The film failed to live up to the hype surrounding it, and instead of groundbreaking cinema, we got just another retelling of Lewis Carroll's story, but bereft of the whimsy synonymous with the original tale. Even with the lukewarm reviews, the movie pulled in over $1 billion worldwide, and Disney took notice. The annual remake trend we're in the midst of began with 2014's Maleficent. If you've seen the 1959 Sleeping Beauty, you know how cruel and evil Maleficent is. She cursed the infant Aurora to die at age 16, simply because she hadn't been invited to the christening. She knew the princess would be loved by all, making the slow march to her doom excruciating for the parents and the kingdom. Years later, Maleficent captured Prince Philip and vowed to release him after 100 years, meaning he'll be an old man near death when he at last awakens the princess, who won't age while she's asleep. Maleficent then transmorphed into a dragon in order to kill Philip. She has been hailed as one of Disney's most heartless villains, and the remake's trailer suggested it would focus on that wickedness. The finished product, though, presented her as a tragic anti-hero who ended up adopting Aurora. This bait and switch left many people upset, as it dulled Maleficent's figurative claws and showed her as a kind soul. Established facts were altered or swept aside entirely to make this mistress of evil an OOC heart of gold person. The liberties taken turned a promising retelling into what felt like fan fiction. As for 2015's Cinderella remake, the lead character became a vapid shadow of 1950's peppy Cinder Girl. While proclaiming to improve and revolutionize the centuries-old stories, these remakes are doing just what Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland did. Simply tell another variation, like dozens of other people have done in the past. For some reason, though, many think these reboots are revolutionary, when in reality, they're riding the coattails of the original Disney versions, the ones that most everyone know and love. Later this year, we're going to get a remake of the 1977 film Pete's Dragon. Originally an unpublished story by Seton I. Miller and S.S. Field, the psychological tale told of the boy Pete, who, not wanting to deal with reality's hardships, creates the dragon Elliot as an imaginary friend to help him cope. It had been earmarked as a live-action segment in the Disneyland Anthology television series. After Walt Disney's death in 1966, the project was shelved in favor of other films that were under consideration while he had been alive, such as Bedknobs and Broomsticks and The Aristocats. In 1975, Disney finally decided to adapt Pete's Dragon into a film. The psychological element was eliminated, and it became a live-action fantasy. Elliot was originally going to be shown in a single dream sequence and be invisible the remainder of the time, but the animators convinced executive producer Ron Miller to include more scenes of him. Ken Anderson, who had worked as a Disney animator since 1934, designed the dragon, and the legendary Don Bluth served as animation director. The 1900s period piece followed Pete, an orphan boy fleeing from his abusive adoptive family, the Gogans, with Elliot. Pete is taken in by the kind lighthouse keeper Nora and her father Lampy. The Gogans track Pete down and team up with the snake oil salesman Dr. Terminus to snatch both the boy and the dragon. Of course, the bad guys' plans are foiled. Nora's lost-at-sea fiancé returns, they adopt Pete, and Elliot bids them farewell, in order to help another child in distress. The movie released November 3, 1977, and received mixed reviews, but has since earned a large following. The flick had 12 musical numbers, one of which was nominated for Best Song at the 1977 Academy Awards. It's an endearing movie that teaches the importance of hope and friendship. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you do. Even though it wasn't as popular as Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella, Disney decided to give Pete's Dragon the reboot treatment, first announcing the plan in March 2013. David Lowery and Tony Holbrooks, who both worked on the independent film Ain't Them Bodies Saints, have penned the screenplay. Supposedly, it will, quote, reinvents the core story of a venerable Disney family film and will not be a musical, unquote. What? The songs served as cohesive segues in moving the plot forward. Despite some people saying musicals are outdated, they're in fact a staple to Disney films, so much so that the recent blockbuster, Frozen, was one. It's very obvious that Disney and audiences, who forked out over $1 billion on the film, don't consider musicals passé. Bryce Dallas Howard, who will play the character Grace, said she and Wes Bentley hummed here and there in the movie when asked if it would be a musical. Ugh. The movie will no longer take place in the 1900s, but in the 1980s. This switch was made because the filmmakers hope it'll appeal to the people who were kids watching the original in the late 1970s/early 1980s. It was also suggested that setting it in the 1980s would allow the comedy aspect to work better, because we all know humor wasn't around in the Victorian age based on those austere photos. It's like how the whole world was black and white until the 1960s, when color television came around. The original movie was filled with slapstick and one-liners in vaudeville-like style, so humor wasn't lacking. As for thinking it'll click more with the original demographic if it's set in the 1980s, that's a ridiculous concept. If the original viewers want to stroll down memory lane, they'll watch the first film. You know, the one they saw as children, not a remake set 80 years later. Or, excuse me, it takes place in both the 1980s and modern day 2016. I say this because there's a credit for a 41-year-old Pete, which means he's 41 currently and is telling the story to somebody. Filmmakers shouldn't take a period piece and remake it to reflect the era of the original's theatrical release. Imagine if the Lord of the Rings trilogy is rebooted 30 years from now. How would you feel if it was set in the early 2000s? And the reason given was because that was when the original trilogy came out, and it would appeal more to the original demographic. The more logical reason Pete's Dragon isn't set in Victorian times anymore is because period pieces are very expensive to make. The budget for this film hasn't been disclosed, but the fact that Disney applied for grants from the New Zealand governments to get production funds hints that the budget may not be anywhere near 2015 Cinderella's $95 million. More on that grants later. It seems the abusive family subplot may be omitted altogether in this retelling. Pete's parents were killed in a car crash, and the boy has been living in the woods, watched over by Elliot, for 6 years. Didn't the police get reports of a missing child and conduct a search? Pete is described as, quote, almost, unquote, feral, and is discovered by the forest ranger Grace, and she starts taking care of him. A young child isolated from human contact for that long would be completely feral, not almost feral. Documented cases about feral children describe the individual's lack of speech, having no desire to interact with other humans, and possess no social skills. It can take years to rehabilitate them. I'm sure, though, Pete will just have a dirty face and matted hair when Grace finds him, and while he may initially be skeptical about her, he'll befriend her quickly, speak English at a 10-year-old child's level, and will integrate into society flawlessly. Grace's father, played by Robert Redford, will be a dragon enthusiast who weaves wild tales about the scaly beast, but no one will believe him. He's a reconstructed Lampy, only this time, chances are he won't partake in alcohol. For some reason, there's no footage of the D23 teaser trailer anywhere, so I'll outline what happens. Redford's character discusses with Grace how Pete could have survived those years in the forest alone, but Grace knows he wasn't alone. He then looks at a drawing Pete made of Elliot, and he asks, "He drew this?" with misty eyes, focusing on the past. This seems to indicate that he recognizes Elliot in the picture, meaning he knew the dragon when he himself was a child, and that's why he's a dragon enthusiast now. Remember what I'd said earlier about how the original short story was more psychological, and Pete imagined the dragon? Even though the 1977 screenplay had been rewritten as fantasy, one could still see the traces of the first concept. Elliot showed up when Pete needed him most, could only be seen by him when invisible, and served as the boy's protector. Elliot leaving at the end was a metaphor that Pete, now adopted by a loving family, no longer felt afraid. Elliot, in essence, worked the same way as the id monster from 1956's Forbidden Planet. Dr. Morbius so desperately wanted to protect himself and his daughter from harm that his mind inadvertently created an invisible, tangible being that was the psychological manifestation of his id, one of the three components of personality in all humans that drives instinctual wants, such as selfishness and self-preservation. The id monster destroyed all it saw as a threat to Morbius, similar to how Elliot protected Pete from harm. In the new movie, though, Elliot is indeed an honest-to-goodness dragon who's been living in the forest for decades and has been Redford's character's childhood friends, meaning they're wild dragons up in Maine. Oh yes, the forest. So this movie, like the original, takes place in Passamaquoddy Bay, Maine. Since Grace is a forest ranger, and forest rangers work in state, federal parks, and wildlife refuges, it's safe to say she's either employed in the Great Works Wildlife Management Area or Cobscook Bay State Park. The antagonists this time around, instead of the bumbling Dr. Terminus and the Gogans, are greedy loggers intent on clear-cutting the forest where Elliot lives and Grace works. Let me give you all a little education on Forestry 101. Commercial logging is prohibited in animal refuges and state parks. Limited logging is allowed only to remove diseased trees, control insect infestation, and reduce fire hazards, according to U.S. state forestry laws. The move to replace Dr. Terminus and the Gogans with Captain Planet-esque bad guy loggers that paints the real logging industry as tyrannical is an attempt to shoehorn in a moral message about the environment. 1977's Pete's Dragon taught us to stay optimistic and to accept others. The reboot, knowing it needed new villains because it had nixed the Gogans and the con man who wanted to poach Elliot, seemed to pull a random idea from a hat to create this Ferngully/Avatar indoctrination. It makes no sense that the logging industry is destroying a state park because the law wouldn't allow it in real life. And yes, people may argue that it's a kid's movie and that I should overlook this glaring error, but this reboot is supposedly going for a darker, more realistic tone than the original, which brings up another conundrum. The filmmakers are wanting a darker tone, yet they're saying it'll have more comedy than the original because it's set in the 1980s. Huh? In an interview, Howard said the film is more poignant, classic, and sophisticated than the 1977 version, and compared it to a Hayao Miyazaki film. Why do these remakes involve transforming classics into somber, edgy movies? This is what happened with Avatar: The Last Airbender. The filmmakers took what was fun and clever and changed it into drab and solemn. Remember how well it was received? Elliot will be CGI'd this time, and he's covered in fur. Does that mean he's Lavalou, the furry dragon that terrorized France in medieval times? This reboot will have a girl named Natalie, played by Una Lawrence, befriends Pete. If you've watched the original movie, you'll know Pete didn't have any children friends. I am speculating that he'll spend a lot of time with her in this new movie. Elliot will grow jealous and, in an act of revenge, team up with the bad guys and/or terrorize the city. Wes Bentley portrays the local mill owner, Jack, and Carl Urban will play his greedy brother, Gavin. Principal photography began on January 21st, 2015, in various New Zealand regions, as well as Peter Jackson's Stone Street Studios, making it the first film to use the facility since The Hobbit wrapped. To quote producer Jim Whittaker, quote, "We were searching for a shooting location that captures the wonder and spirit of Pete's Dragon. The New Zealand aesthetic beautifully matches what the screenplay requires, and we're grateful to receive such tremendous support from the filmmaking community and industry in the country," unquote. I thought New Zealand seemed a bit far for the filming location when there are plenty of temperate broadleaf mixed forest in the United States and Canada. As I dug deeper though, I found some interesting news. Remember that New Zealand government screen production grant I mentioned earlier? Well, turns out the location choice may not have been chosen solely for beauty. Disney received an allowance of 25% of the film's mystery budget from the New Zealand government in exchange for the following stipulations. 1. At least 90% of the shoot to be carried out in New Zealand. 2. At least 75% of the total budget for visual effects productions to be spent in New Zealand. 3. At least 6 key personnel roles to be filled by New Zealanders. 4. At least 75% of the production crew to be New Zealanders. Disney was given funds by New Zealand if they filmed in the country and hired New Zealanders. The role of Gavin was originally going to be filled by American actor Michael C. Hall of Dexter fame, but it was announced 9 days after filming started that New Zealander Carl Urban got it instead. Rumor is Hall left due to a scheduling conflict. He joined the cast on January 9th, which suggests his schedule was free at that time. You have to wonder if Urban getting the role of Gavin was due to rule number 3 in the grant conditions. Rule number 2 stated that 75% of the visual effects budget had to go to a New Zealand company, so the chances that New Zealand Weta will provide the effects are high. The film will end with Pete finding his family. Whether that means blood relatives or an adoptive one, that remains to be unseen. This remake is a slap in the face to anyone who fell in love with the original Pete's Dragon. The first movie was jaunty, with toe-tapping songs, and a simple, loving moral. This new one is trying to make it realistic by ditching the musical numbers and swapping out the charm with gravitas. No matter how real they try making it, it's still a story about a dragon, which is, the furthest from realism you could get. The one-dimensional, avaricious corporation and loggers villains won't mesh with the realism they're trying to go for because, again, the logging industry doesn't conduct business the way it's portrayed in the film, which comes across as a mustache-twirling, cackling bad guy. This whole movie feels like it can't find its identity. Is it a comedy or a drama? Is it about an orphan boy, a dragon living deep in the woods, a corporation taking over a small town and blatantly getting away with clear-cutting a state park, a feral child who must be rehabilitated into society and finds his family, or the fact that said boy was hiding for 6 years and there weren't any searches conducted to find him? Will people want to watch this movie? I think it'll be marketed as deep and thought-provoking, and people will watch it because the trailer will come off as intriguing, like Maleficent's trailers were, but folks will quickly see how patchwork the plot will be. Fans of the original will probably skip this altogether, because they know nothing will top the original. What will audiences and critics feel about it? I think some fans will be more forgiving of this than critics. Critics may say it can't find its identity and has too many subplots. Word will probably spread quickly that, while it has some beautiful visuals, it feels empty. Will it make money at the box office? Probably not as much as 2015's Cinderella, but it'll make a fair amount, simply because it's a Disney movie. Was it a good idea to make this movie? Disney's live-action remakes are a direct-to-video sequels 2.0 phase. They're dipping into their previous works and repackaging them to generate more revenue. Those other sequels, though, were based on well-known Disney IP. Even their upcoming Jungle Book and Beauty and the Beast have large followings. Pete's Dragon is a modest little flick that still hangs under the radar for most people nowadays. What made Disney decide to choose it among other well-known contenders? Even if it was well-known, the story has been altered and revamped so much that it barely resembles the original, which was what happened with Jem and the holograms. And finally, what will be the lasting impression for this flick? If filmmakers are going for nostalgia, they could go about it better. Nostalgia is returning to a bygone era of one's past. It's not rewriting a movie so it takes place in the era it was released, just so it panders to the audience. It's not eradicating musical numbers and throwing in a few seconds of humming. It's not switching the feel-good vibe with gritty austerity, and it's certainly not combining all of the above and slapping on the original name to piggyback on the original's success and charm. Disney shouldn't succumb to Hollywood's current trend of reboots, remakes, and sequels. In the past, both Pixar and Disney made standalone gems of stories, one movie for each tale. Pixar is now producing sequels for their franchises. We're getting Cars 3, which barely anyone asked for. We're going to see the toys again in Toy Story 4, even though Toy Story 3 had a proper ending. And Disney is now remaking tales that have already stood the test of time. If they continue with this, we're going to be seeing more characters from the past glory days instead of new ones. Disney can be imaginative when they want to be, and there isn't a shortage of fairy tales or original works that they haven't brought to life. Disney is grabbing their own works from decades past and slapping on a new coat of paint. They may claim it's fresh and unique, but it's still the same thing underneath. While writing this pre-review, the villain's song, Every Little Piece, from the original Pete's Dragon, in which Dr. Terminus sings about how he'll make a fortune by selling Elliots piece by piece, kept coming to my mind, and I couldn't help but imagine some folks at Disney singing it, knowing that Elliot, like the other remakes, will rake in more cash for them. Walt Disney embraced new ideas. To quote him again, quote, "We keep moving forward, opening new doors, and doing new things, because we're curious, and curiosity keeps leading us down new paths," unquote. It was that curiosity that gave us talking cartoons, full-length animated movies, The Happiest Place on Earth, a futuristic park in a former Florida swamp, and the beloved brand and name known by everyone around the world. Let's hope that Disney Company will start looking forward towards the future instead of clinging to its past. And the next pre-review will be, my, what a coincidence. Someone's got a gripe about it, and that someone is Marplotic.